When we think of metalworking in the ancient Americas, our minds typically conjure images of the magnificent gold and silver artifacts from the great Aztec and Inca empires. Eastern North America, however, is not commonly associated with a rich metalworking tradition. Yet, surprisingly, the indigenous peoples of the eastern United States and Canada utilized copper mined from the Lake Superior Basin for thousands of years. This history of copper usage is incredibly fascinating, and today we're going to uncover its remarkable story. Welcome to Echoes of Time as we delve into a remarkable chapter of ancient American ingenuity. Prepare to have your understanding of ancient technology completely reshaped. On the shores of Lake Superior lies one of North America's greatest geological features, the Keweenaw Peninsula. This modest peninsula in Michigan's Upper Peninsula may appear unassuming on a map, but it harbors a secret most are unaware of. It is the richest source of native copper in the world. This colossal copper deposit extends through the Keweenaw, beneath the lake, and even through Isle Royale. It is the product of eons of geological and glacial forces which tirelessly formed, moved, and exposed this copper to the surface. Even today, surface deposits of this native copper vein remain visible. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is native copper? It's a geological term referring to copper that naturally occurs in a nearly pure state. Most copper mined globally is combined with other minerals, forming an ore that requires smelting to remove impurities before it can be fashioned. Native copper, on the other hand, is ready to be worked as soon as it's extracted. While deposits of native copper exist elsewhere in the world, they are typically small and often difficult to access. In the Keweenaw, however, it is extraordinarily abundant and remarkably easy to obtain. Beyond its abundance, copper is also exceptionally easy to work. It is much softer than other metals like iron, making it relatively straightforward to fashion. Furthermore, copper possesses an undeniable beauty. While you might typically envision its weathered, greenish patina, it's easy to overlook that polished copper gleams with a rich, reddish gold luster. Combine these qualities with the fact that the Lake Superior Basin lacks high-quality flint and chert, the preferred materials for tools in many other regions, and it becomes clear why copper quickly became a natural and highly valued crafting material. But when did this all begin? To trace the origins of copper working in North America, we must journey far back to the Archaic period, which spanned from approximately 7000 BCE to 1000 BCE. It is during this period that archaeology begins to reveal distinct cultures emerging from Paleo-Indian traditions. By 7500 BCE, the glaciers had finally retreated from Lake Superior, enabling Paleo-Indians to settle in the basin. During the early Archaic period, this region was inhabited by various groups of hunter-gatherers who seasonally migrated to exploit abundant resources such as migratory birds, nuts, berries, fish, and both small and large game. The only domesticated species would have been the dog, an invaluable companion for hunting, protection, friendship, and, if necessary, sustenance. This era saw the emergence of new technologies, including the atlatl, or spear thrower, the first archaeologically attested watercraft, fishing nets, and, most importantly for our discussion today, copper tools. As mentioned earlier, the local stones available for crafting in this area were of rather poor quality, making copper the natural and preferred crafting material. The archaic societies of the Upper Great Lakes that utilized copper to create tools and wares are broadly referred to as the Old Copper Culture, or sometimes the Old Copper Complex. It would be misleading to consider this a single, unified culture, but rather a collection of related cultures and communities. The Old Copper Culture shares many similarities with the subsequent Red Ochre Culture and Glacial Kame Culture, all of which employed copper and exhibited similar mortuary practices. Notably, copper use was not a late archaic invention, but an early one. Very recent studies have pushed back the earliest verifiable date for copper working in the Keweenaw, and indeed all of North America, to an astounding 8,500 years ago, or nearly 6,500 BCE. To place that in a global perspective, this is precisely when people in the Old World were just beginning to work copper. This makes the Old Copper culture one of the oldest metalworking societies in the world. These archaic people were on the same technological curve as the forerunners in Eurasia, and possibly even ahead of them. So, how was copper mined? First, the inhabitants had to identify exploitable copper sources. Although we lack indigenous accounts of their exact methods, we can speculate based on written records from other ancient societies worldwide. What's clear from these accounts is that copper can be detected through careful observation of the surrounding environment. Patterns of frost and snow, differences in vegetation, and erosion can all serve as telltale signs to a keen eye. Remember, the archaic peoples of Lake Superior would have been naturally observant and inquisitive, possessing a deep knowledge of the landscape and environment that sustained them. In some instances, it may not have required much effort at all. Copper freed from veins by natural erosion could simply be found along riverbanks. Surface veins of copper would have also made sourcing remarkably straightforward. Once a source was identified, the copper had to be mined. Ancient miners would have used hammerstones to expand natural cracks in the rock until the copper could be leveraged or gouged out. After the copper was removed, any unwanted rock inclusions were hammered out as needed. Another possible method to facilitate copper mining and extraction was heating and quenching. This technique was employed across the ancient world and involved stacking wood or charcoal against the rock, igniting it, and then rapidly cooling the heated copper with cold water. The expansion from the heat and subsequent sudden contraction from the cold water would cause the rock to fracture. Unfortunately, there's no scholarly consensus on whether this method was used to mine copper in the Great Lakes, but it was certainly feasible, and many academics believe it was employed. One method that was definitively not used was deep tunneling and excavation. Ancient copper miners exclusively focused on the abundant, easily accessible surface deposits, never needing to resort to shaft mining. Some of you may have noticed that these methods bear a strong resemblance to quarrying, and that's a perceptive observation. It's highly probable that the people of the old copper culture viewed copper not as a metal, but as a stone, and approached its exploitation in a similar manner. Once the copper was mined, it was ready to be fashioned. The primary process for manufacturing copper goods was cold hammering. Copper is relatively soft and ductile among metals, allowing it to be hammered into shape with effort and precise blows. This approach is not dissimilar to how other materials like stone would have been crafted, indicating a consistent methodology. However, ancient coppersmiths also recognized copper's unique properties. Like other metalworking cultures, they discovered how to use annealing to make the copper more malleable. What is annealing? It's the process of heating copper to increase its malleability. When copper is heated above its recrystallization point, around 600 degrees Celsius, it can be annealed. At this temperature, the copper becomes significantly more pliable and easier to work. Experiment replications of copper artifacts prove that these could have easily been made if they were annealed. It's important to remember that this is not the same as smelting and casting. To melt native copper, you need to heat it to 1083 degrees Celsius. While creating fires at such temperatures was certainly possible, there is currently no evidence that any copper in North America was worked at these extreme temperatures. Once these processes were completed, copper pieces could be ground, cut, embossed, perforated, and polished to achieve their final form. These methods were employed not just by the old copper culture, but by all subsequent copper working cultures in North America right up until European contact. This is admittedly a simpler approach to copper working, but we will discuss why that is later on. More advanced metallurgical techniques were developed in South America and subsequently spread to Mesoamerica, but that technology never penetrated Eastern North America. One wonders how different history might have been had that occurred. So, what was made with all this copper? Almost any tool imaginable was at some point crafted from copper. Arrowheads, spear points, knives, spuds, awls, ulus, harpoons, fish hooks, needles, axes, chisels, and more have been recovered. As you can see, there's an incredible breadth and versatility to these tool sets used for a variety of trades such as hunting, fishing, woodworking, sewing, and general crafting. When you observe these artifacts, it's important to imagine them with their original handles and shafts, nearly all of which have long since decayed. From the blades and points, we can discern that the people of the old copper culture employed different methods for securing them to their handles. Some featured tangs that would have been inserted into the handle or shaft, while others were socketed, designed to fit over the shaft. The variety found is astounding. Essentially, if a task needed doing, the people of the old copper culture would craft a copper solution. To our knowledge, the only tools never made of copper were the hammerstones themselves, essential for mining. If you ever encounter a museum exhibit filled with ancient North American copper artifacts, they are almost certainly made with Great Lakes copper. The Archaic period can truly be seen as a golden age of copper tools, and that's not even considering the ornamental pieces like beads, crescents, bracelets, pectorals, and ceremonial headgear. Finding copper artifacts is not particularly difficult. They are numerous, and archaeologists and locals alike have been recovering them for centuries. Many a farmer in Wisconsin and Michigan has inadvertently unearthed a copper artifact with their plow or shovel. They are so common, in fact, that some individuals have made a hobby of combing the wilderness with metal detectors in search of copper artifacts. This, however, presents a significant problem, as when these pieces are removed from the ground without proper documentation, their invaluable archaeological context is lost. Almost all known copper artifacts have been recovered not by archaeologists from archaeological sites, but by non-archaeologists. It's crucial to understand that even though copper artifacts are abundant and easy to find, they can't tell us much about the people who produced them unless they are discovered within an archaeological context. This is key. For example, imagine a copper knife passed down through your family, found by a relative as a child, polished, and kept as a keepsake. If you were to bring that knife to an archaeologist, they could likely tell you it resembles other copper knives from a specific period based on its features. Interesting, but not terribly insightful. Now, consider if that same blade were found by an archaeologist in a burial. In that context, they could probably determine its age based on other datable materials within the burial. They could also identify the type of person the knife belonged to, or, if recovered within the remains of an individual, identify it as a weapon, suggesting the practice of warfare. There's even more a copper artifact can reveal. Copper is particularly unique among minerals because when it oxidizes, it can trap and preserve organic material. Oxidized copper acts as a natural preservative, warding off bacteria and microbes that would otherwise consume organic material. In very fortunate cases, it's possible to discern exactly what the knife was used for if organic remains are preserved within the copper oxide. In other instances, bits of string and textiles can also be preserved. With all that said, we hope you can appreciate how important archaeological context is to understanding how artifacts fit into a larger cultural picture. The unfortunate truth is that despite the abundance of copper artifacts, probably less than 1% have a well-documented archaeological provenance. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that only a small handful of old copper culture archaeological sites in this region have been properly excavated. The most notable include the Osceola, Oconto, and Ray sites in Wisconsin, and the Riverside Cemetery site in Menominee, Michigan. A brief aside regarding the Menominee and Oconto sites. It was quite astonishing to realize that these locations have been passed many times. If you ever drive on US Route 41 through Wisconsin and up into Michigan, you'll pass very close to both sites. The Oconto site is actually visible from the highway, and it hosts the Copper Culture State Park, which, during warmer months, offers a fascinating glimpse into this ancient history. The Riverside site in Menominee, however, currently lacks any prominent markers or plaques, which is remarkable considering it's one of the most famous archaeological sites in the United States. All of these mentioned sites contained burials, many of which held copper goods. One interesting revelation from these sites is that copper slowly evolved from a utilitarian good into a prestige item over time. In fact, nearly all the copper tools we saw earlier disappear from the archaeological record after the woodland period begins. The people of the upper Great Lakes started making very few tools out of copper, opting instead for tools made from imported stone. Make no mistake, copper working was still alive and well, but production shifted dramatically, focusing on ornaments and decorations. But why, you might ask, would a culture abandon metal tools for stone? Surely metal tools are superior, right? It's a complex but fascinating story. There are two key points to emphasize here. First, culture changed profoundly during the Archaic period. Remember, the Archaic period spans 6,000 years, and much evolved from its beginning to its end. In the early Archaic period, we detect no elite burials, which strongly indicates smaller, more egalitarian societies. By the Woodland period, societies had grown larger and more complex, with evidence of elite burials and social stratification for community leaders. Copper increasingly became a material with which to showcase their status and adorn themselves. Already by this point, it had become a valuable trade commodity for centuries. Thus, copper began to be viewed as a luxury material rather than a utilitarian one. Second, copper was becoming less and less cost-effective as a resource for tool production. The fact is, copper requires significant time and energy to mine and fashion. By contrast, creating tools from stone demands a far smaller investment of effort. Now, you may argue that while copper tools take longer to produce, surely they perform much better than stone tools, thereby justifying the larger investment. And there is some truth to this. Copper arrowheads, spear points, knives, and awls do perform better than their stone counterparts, but not by a large margin, certainly not enough to justify the increased investment. The cost-benefit simply wasn't there. During the early Archaic period, when food was abundant and populations were lower, investing the time and energy to make copper tools was much easier because less effort was needed to secure food. By the late Archaic, resources became scarcer as the upper Great Lakes environment dried out. Concurrently, competition from other communities intensified, requiring more time and energy to secure sustenance. Additionally, burgeoning trade networks made higher quality stone more available than ever. In this changed environment, it became more economically viable for indigenous people to create tools from stone. Copper tools were likely seen as over-engineered. Coppersmiths, therefore, chose to invest their precious time not in crafting utilitarian knives and points, but in creating prestige goods that could be readily traded for other commodities or offered as gifts. Interestingly, copper did continue to be the material of choice for one specific tool, the awl. But the other tools that so characterized the old copper culture had largely disappeared. After all that, you're probably wondering, if people in the Americas started working metal at the same time as people in the Old World, why did they never progress to bronze or iron working? Why was copper never smelted and cast, especially when they clearly knew that heat made copper easier to work? After all, nearly all other copper-working cultures, even in the Americas, eventually figured out how to smelt copper and combine it with other metals to create different alloys. These are all fabulous questions with fascinating answers. To address them, we need to return to the source of all this copper. Remember our earlier discussion about native copper. Native copper was naturally pure and ready to be crafted. By contrast, most copper and most metals in the world are mined in the form of ores. To extract the usable metal from the ore, it must be smelted to remove unwanted minerals. When copper is naturally pure, why bother with smelting? Smelting was a solution to a problem the people of the Upper Great Lakes never faced. Because they never had to smelt copper ore, there was no impetus or opportunity to develop the techniques for combining copper with other metals or casting it. From a technological perspective, having easy access to native copper was a mixed blessing, almost spoiling its children. From a historical perspective, it created a unique experience unlike any other in the world. No other culture appears to have plateaued their copper technology in the same way. Even if copper working in Eastern North America never developed to the technological heights of other cultures, it was still profoundly important, not just to the people of the Great Lakes, but to all peoples of Eastern North America. By 2000 BCE, copper goods were widespread across the eastern woodlands. Copper trading was so prolific that cultures outside the Lake Superior Basin acquired copper, which they then used to create their own tools. A prime example of this is the Morrison's Island site near the Ottawa River. Even though this location is far from the copper-producing areas of Lake Superior, its burials contain an abundance of copper tools and ornaments, very similar to contemporary sites in Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Copper was typically traded along the St. Lawrence, Ohio, and Mississippi waterways, but it is also found in the northern plains. Copper ornaments abound in the Great Hopewell and Mississippian burials of the lower Midwest, and even farther near the Gulf Coast. Great Lakes copper has even been recovered from sites like Poverty Point in Louisiana. Chemical analysis confirms that the copper found at these distant sites originates from the Great Lakes, not another source. While native copper from other eastern sources began to be exploited during later woodland and Mississippian times, in the Archaic period it was exclusively from the Great Lakes. This is truly impressive. It is assumed that this trade took the form of small, down-the-line exchanges via the eastern water routes. What was given in return for all this copper is not entirely certain. We do know that various lithics were being traded. Remember, the copper country is rich in copper, but poor in high-quality stone for tools such as obsidian, chert, and pipestone. For instance, at the Riverside site in Menominee, a woman was found buried with a huge chunk of obsidian. Chemical analysis revealed that this obsidian originated all the way from Yellowstone, over 1,800 kilometers away, a testament to impressive long-distance trade. Other non-local materials found in burials include galena, sourced further south and west. Perhaps the most important material, however, is marine shell from the Atlantic coast, commonly found not just in the Lake Superior Basin, but across the entire East. Unfortunately, the temperate climate of the Great Lakes does not preserve organic materials very well, making it difficult to speculate on perishable goods that might have been part of this exchange. Regardless of what was exchanged for copper, it was clearly a highly prized resource by everyone who came into contact with it. Now we arrive at a topic that often sparks lively discussions: conspiracy theories. North American copper has long been at the center of some truly ludicrous claims. For some reason, European settlers throughout history were particularly astonished that Indigenous Americans possessed copper working skills. In the 19th century, many theorized that copper artifacts found in native burials were of foreign manufacture. In other words, that Europeans brought over a quantity of copper which indigenous peoples then reworked in their own fashion. Thankfully, other scholars and archaeologists pushed back against this nonsense. Most importantly, Frank Cushing, who observed metalworking methods in Zuni silversmithing in the American Southwest, realized that their craft was wholly original. He concluded that coppersmithing in the Great Lakes was most certainly indigenous as well. Using the Zuni methods he observed, he was able to recreate any type of American copper artifact, proving these were indigenous creations, not foreign imports. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, chemical analysis has conclusively proven that American copper originates from copper sources within America, not abroad. Another popular, albeit colorful and somewhat problematic, theory suggests that North American copper was traded to the Mediterranean world as part of a vast Atlantic trading network. This theory gained notoriety, or infamy, through Barry Fell's pseudoscience books in the late 1970s and 80s. For the record, Fell was a scientist, but a marine biologist, not an archaeologist. According to Fell, ancient Phoenician sailors made contact with pre-Columbian America, traded for copper, transported it back to the Mediterranean, and then combined it with tin from the British Isles to create bronze. The people who mined and traded this copper, he claimed, were not Native Americans. No, don't ask why, but rather displaced Iberians who settled in the modern-day United States and, inexplicably, created much of the Eastern woodland culture. Fell's argument rests on the fact that indeed, some Celtic artifacts have been recovered in the eastern United States by locals. Archaeologists, however, are quick to point out that none of these artifacts possess any archaeological context. Remember our earlier discussion about the critical importance of context. Without it, these few artifacts could simply be heirlooms brought over from Europe and subsequently lost. There's actually a more plausible theory as to how they arrived in America. These artifacts tend to be recovered near ports and landing sites, and they are most likely the result of ballast dumped overboard by ships. When ships sailed from Europe to the Americas, they often loaded their hulls with rocks and other dead weight as ballast to keep the vessel stable during the Atlantic crossing. Upon arrival, this ballast would be offloaded to make room for cargo returning to Europe. It's highly probable that a Celtic artifact or two ended up in a ship's hold as ballast and was inadvertently left behind. There are even more recent variations of this global copper trade conspiracy theory still circulating online, but for now, we'll leave them aside. But enough of conspiracy theories. Let's return to the facts. Copper was an integral resource of Eastern North America, prized for its unique qualities. It's also incredibly important because copper preserves spectacularly, and when recovered properly, it can tell us a great deal about a culture. Despite this, copper working is often overlooked by the public at large. There's a common stereotype that Indigenous Americans in the United States and Canada were Stone Age people who lacked metalworking. On the contrary, the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes exploited the natural metal around them in a manner that was practical, elegant, and remarkably efficient. The next time you're in a museum, keep your eyes peeled for copper artifacts, and if you see them, you can appreciate the incredible history behind copper working in North America. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.